Master asked, "Why study?" Zhan Feiyu's mind came to mind with his squatting pit and dry toilet, his small body straightened up, and he answered with a milky voice, "Be sensible and debate right and wrong." A few years later, the regent looked at his youngest daughter in law, who was only 3 yuan old, and said, "Why study?" Zhan Feiyu looked up with an innocent and sincere expression on his face. "Do you believe what I said about the toilet made for sandalwood?" After traveling through time, Zhan Feiyu was most grateful to 2 people. The first was the time-traveling seniors who changed the imperial examination system. One is to give the only warmth and softness to his regent, Lord Regent. Fierce, ruthless in killing people, Regent Wang versus pseudo-scholar bully, selfish and cold-blooded little female lead. Zhan Feiyu has been ruthless towards himself, his family, and his enemies in his lifetime, but he is very cowardly towards the regent king who has several times more than himself in terms of age. He is known as a hero who knows current affairs. Keywords of the novel. I went to ancient times to take the imperial examination without a pop-up window. I went to ancient times to download the complete text of the imperial examination. I went to the latest chapter of the imperial examination to read. Chapter 1. Private School Quota. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Private School Quota. In July, with the scorching fire, Jinlin village faces mountains on both sides, but it doesn't seem hot when facing water. Only the rustling summer cicadas on the branches make people feel restless. Your father and I haven't died yet, it's not up to you to make the decision in the Lao Zhan family. Sharp screams rang out, and Lao Zhan's withered lips quickly opened, spitting uncontrollably and suppressing the anger of her 2 daughter-in-law in an instant. "Mom, calm down and drink some water." Xiao Yao, who was scolded, had thick skin and picked up a coarse porcelain teapot on the table, poured a cup of water, and handed it over with a flattering smile. "Mom, we'll do whatever you say." "Humph, everyone is restless." Mrs. Zhan still had a wrinkled old face, her cannibalistic eyes fierce and harsh. However, when faced with her niece and second daughter-in-law, Mrs. Zhan gave a smile at the corner of her mouth and poured a cup of coarse tea water in just a few sips. In the lower right corner of the main hall, 7-year-old Zhan Feiyu lowered his head, his round bun-like face with dark big eyes flashing, and his eyes shining with a light that did not belong to a child. Suddenly, his head heated up, and Zhan Feiyu blinked his dark eyes. His chubby face, which was raised, was full of confusion. "Mother." Li, the daughter-in-law of the wealthy family, is a round-faced woman who is not good-looking, but has a warm smile. She gently rubbed her daughter's head and whispered, "Don't be afraid. The Zhan family has a total of 3 bedrooms. As both Mr. Zhan and his wife, Yao, are still alive and their parents are present, there are more than a dozen people living together. Today, the second and third bedrooms have been in a row over the number of study spots. After the reform of the Empress Dowager of the previous dynasty, women were also allowed to attend private schools and take the imperial examination. Women from wealthy families could read, but it was rare for them to study hard for 10 years to take the imperial examination. How can they get married when the flowering period is delayed? As for the poor families, they can't even afford a boy's education, let alone the girl who is getting married early or late. The only daughter of the Zhan family is Zhan Feiyu, and the target of the Zhan old lady's harsh scolding just now does not include the 3 of them. Glancing at his fierce and furry grandmother, Zhan Feiyu obediently nodded. The big house had no children, and the couple in the Zhan family were just 2 old scalpers. They woke up earlier than chickens and slept later than dogs, but the advantage of the Zhan family was that they didn't get in touch at all. With a clang, Mrs. Zhan heavily placed the empty teacup back on the table, her murky old eyes fixed on the younger members of the Zhan family below. The 2 daughters-in-law who caused trouble both curled up and said with a cold expression, "Which of the things we eat and wear at home doesn't cost money? Master Lin repairs 10 taels of silver a year, and your father and I have taken out all the coffins. There's no need to go to the private school for another argument. Come back and go to the fields. The cicadas chirped and cursed incessantly, and Zhan Feiyu, a 12-year-old from the second room, impatiently complained, "Ah Nai, I'm back in the room to practice calligraphy. Master will check it the day after tomorrow." The grandson spoke up, and Mrs. Zhan's fierce expression instantly turned into love. She grinned with yellow teeth and said, "Dalong, hurry back to your room. Tonight, Ah Nai will stew an egg for you. Dalang, bring your younger brother along and let San Lang also recognize a few more characters." Second daughter. Law Xiaoyao gave her younger son a push and glanced at the third daughter. Law with pride, deliberately raising her voice. "San Lang studied diligently with your brother. The last time, the master praised your two brothers for their intelligence. Maybe our old Zhan family will have a pair of talented gentlemen in the future. Alright, let's all go down and rest. Old Zhan is a carefree person, and the children in the second and third rooms are all his grandchildren. It's the same for anyone who goes to school." Xiaoyao obediently supported Mrs. Zhan back to her room to rest, while the men stayed in the main room to continue talking about autumn planting. The sweat beads fell 8 petals, and for the farmers, there was nothing more important than farming. "Sister-in-law, my mother is too biased." As she left the main room, the third wife Ma turned her head and glanced, her expression of resentment not knowing how to conceal it. "De Lang started school at the age of 7, so it's still my second son's turn. Lang is already 8 years old this year. Is it true that the 2 sons born to his second sister. Law are human, and I am not the grandson of the Zhan family?" Ma, with a dark and tingled face, dared not disobey his fierce and harsh mother. Law, but the resentment in his heart could not be dispelled, causing his voice to hoarse and his eyes to turn red. "De Fong Li is a kind person, but he also has a plan. He smiled and advised a few words, it's not that we haven't decided who will enroll yet. When my mother calms down, you can talk to Lao San." Zhan Feiyu let Li lead her out, bowing her head to listen to her mother and 3 aunts talking. If it were a young girl born and raised in Daqing, Zhan Feiyu might have accepted her fate. Not to mention Jinlin village, there are not many girls who have enrolled in Shaanxi County. With that spare money, it's better to pull a piece of cloth to make some clothes for the family. But inside her body is a modern soul. Zhan Feiyu pouts and doesn't have much talent or strategy to achieve great success. However, she doesn't want to be a real blind person. Even if she wants to get married, she also wants to get a title as a female scholar. No matter what happens in the future, with fame, at least she has human rights. The persimmon branches and leaves in the yard were lush, and under the shade of the trees, Li and other angry third brother's wife left after complaining. Only then did they speak softly, "Little fish, it's hot outside, go back to the house with your mother." The 3 houses of the Zhan family are not separated, and each son has 3 rooms, which can be considered wealthy in Jinlin village. In the room, Zhan Feiyu sat down on a square stool and looked up at the gentle-looking Li family. A soft and sticky voice sounded, "Mom, I also want to go to a private school." Li, who was pouring tea, shook her hand and spilled tea all over the table. After a while, Li, who was wiping the table, spoke softly and said, "Little fish, I know you've been wronged." Perhaps facing her immature daughter, Li no longer concealed her grievances, but still kept her voice down from being heard by her in-laws and sister-in-law. "Your father has worked so hard, and my mother wants to send you to a private school, but you are the mistress of the family," she said. "If there is a son, the gentle and gently family, even if she tears her face and is scolded by her mother-in-law for being unfilial, she will still argue. The entire Zhan family and their big house are the hardest and most tiring. Why do they earn money to let the children of the second and third families go to private schools? But she is just such a girl. Even if Li Shi is not fair, she cannot say that she wants her daughter to go to a private school. No one in the entire Zhan family will agree, and the person in charge of the family will not agree." The resentment and unwillingness in her eyes eventually disappeared, and Li didn't speak again. She picked up a small bamboo dustpan and began sewing. Zhan Feiyu lowered his small head and, with his chubby fingers in his hand, was unwilling to give up this only opportunity from the bottom of his heart. The Zhan family is considered wealthy in the village. Her grandfather is a cook, and whoever has a red or white wedding, let him take care of it. The farm work in the field is also not neglected. Her father is also a skilled worker, and his father manages all 20 acres of land in the Zhan family. The youngest son and eldest grandson are the ones that Mrs. Anai Zhan loves the most, but the second son is the one she relies on the most. The second daughter. In-law is also her niece, and the entire second house of the Zhan family can be said to live the most nourished life. Although Uncle Zhan is a bit cunning, he has a lively mind. A few years ago, he bought a cart and ran twice a day to transport the villagers to the county, where he worked as a laborer. She comes back to help during busy farming hours, which is much easier than her father and earns a lot of money. The key is to buy something every now and then to show filial piety to her milk. As for Zhan Feiyu, her uncle has learned some cooking skills from the grandfather and can also make some money by playing tricks. However, the uncle has a flexible personality and is lazy. Fortunately there is no major problem. And the three daughters-in-law of the Zhan family are also diligent, taking care of the vegetable fields on weekdays, raising a pig and many chickens at home. Occasionally, they also use shoe soles to make some shoes and sell them in the county to support their families. Of course, the prosperity of the Zhan family is relatively high compared to those poor farmers who cannot afford to eat or wear clothes. It takes too much money to study, not to mention Jinlin village. Even if we look at the entire Shaanxi County, there are not many people who can go to private schools to study. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Competition Divide. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Competition Divide. Afternoon, the sun became less scorching, and after resting for over half an hour, Mr. Zhan walked out of his bedroom. As soon as he looked up and saw his daughter sitting on a small stool, learning to sew with embroidery needles and scraps of cloth, Zhan Laoda's rigid and square face softened a bit. "Dad, you're up." Zhan Feiyu lifted his head, and a big smile appeared on his white and tender face. Coupled with his big black and round eyes, he looked much more spiritual than the little girls in the village. Mr. Zhan's broad and rough palm touched his daughter's head and said, "Don't prick your hands." Perhaps he has never had a son, but Mr. Zhan looks dull and serious, with a stern face that can scare and cry children. The children of the Zhan family, even Zhan Dalong, who appeared superior after reading, were somewhat afraid of him as an uncle, but Zhan Feiyu was not afraid. The father-daughter relationship was quite good. Li handed the bamboo tube filled with coarse tea on the table to Mr. Zhan, glanced at the white sun outside the door, and couldn't help but remind him, "There isn't much life in the ground, take it easy, don't get heatstroke." The autumn harvest has passed, and this year is a bountiful year. The rice is growing well, and every household's granary is filled with grain. There won't be much heavy work left, so there are only a few acres of vegetable fields that need to be cleaned up. Accustomed to working with his face to the yellow soil and back to the sky, Zhan Laoda took the bamboo tube and said, "I'm leaving." Boss Zhan walked away with a hoe on his back, and Zhan Feiyu followed him out in a flash. A crisp childlike voice came into the room and said, "Mom, I'll go pick peaches on the mountain." "This girl," Li scolded with a smile and put away the small basket containing needles, thread, and cloth. When Zhan Feiyu arrived at the hillside behind the village, he could hear chattering and noise from afar. Ernyo saw Zhan Feiyu approaching with sharp eyes, and ran over happily. The patch on his knee was loose, swaying in the wind. "Little fish, come on, peaches on this tree are all red." Although Zhan Feiyu is a little girl, she has a high reputation among these children. On weekdays, a group of children play around aimlessly, and you chase after me, but Zhan Feiyu is a good storyteller. Today, you become an official soldier and I become a bandit. Tomorrow, you will be a big tiger in the mountains and I will be a big wild wolf. Similarly, chasing and running around makes a group of children unable to stop because of role-playing. Little fish, there are 5 peaches on the top of this tree that are red. How do you tell them to be separated? The mountain child was sunburned like a black charcoal head. After finishing speaking, he looked up at the top of the tree, and the 2 cows and other children also looked up. Peaches are not evenly distributed, and everyone is greedy. If Zhan Feiyu doesn't come over, a few mischievous boys will probably be able to fight. Learning from a group of friends, Zhan Feiyu also looked up at the top of the tree with his small head in a double bun. A crisp and soft childlike voice sounded, "The 3 fastest runners take a peach, the last 2 cut in half, and the remaining 4 are divided." Ernyo and Shanwazi reacted quickly. Compared to the number of people, anyone could eat it, and there was also fun. The 2 skinny and dark children who were sunbathing spat in their palms with 2 moans, and after rubbing, they climbed onto the peach tree with a quick rub. Got it. There is also a red-lipped one on the left. Ernyo, don't grab it, don't push the mountain boy down. Listening to the shouting of his buddies under the tree, Zhan Feiyu lost all appetite when he thought of the peach that had been soaked in saliva. A moment later, the race ending at the entrance of Zhan's courtyard began, and the cries of 6 or 7 bear children could spread throughout the entire village. They are all things that are not afraid of being exposed to the sun. The ant who passed by smiled and shook her head. Ernyo and Shanwazi shouted and rushed forward, followed by 3 or 4 others. Only Zhan Feiyu followed slowly behind. After Ernyo and Shanwazi won by an absolute advantage, Zhan Feiyu also arrived, and a group of people rushed to the courtyard of the Zhan family with a shout. "Little fish, quickly divide the peaches. I need to drink water, my throat and eyes are smoking." An old well was dug in the yard of Zhan's house. Ernyo, who was 8 years old, picked up a wooden bucket and threw it down. After lifting a small half-bucket of water, the sweaty bear children rushed around with a splash of water. 5 peaches were also thrown into the bucket and washed clean. "It's so noisy, little fish, you guys go out and play." Zhan Dalong opened the window and cursed in dissatisfaction. Zhan Dalong claimed to be a scholar, but as he watched the 2 oxen and the others enjoying themselves all over the mountains and fields, Zhan Dalong's envious eyes turned red. He wished he could tear apart all the books on the table and read nonsense. "Big brother, we're in the competition. Whoever wins will eat peaches." A crisp and cheerful voice sounded, and Zhan Feiyu turned around to show a big smile. "Little fish, I'm the first one, I'll take it first." Ernyo grabbed the largest and reddest one and took a bite. With a click, the juice splashed everywhere, and Ernyo pursed his mouth, eating as if it were a peach. After Zhan Feiyu cut open 2 peaches in the kitchen and took them out, little Yao walked out of the left hall. Looking at a group of children holding peaches and gnawing on them, little Yao hadn't said anything yet, but Sanlang rushed out and stared eagerly at half a peach in Zhan Feiyu's hand. "Sister." "Sanlang, that's from Xiaoyu, don't be greedy," Xiaoyao pretended to scold her younger son. Although the 2 children are of the same age, Zhan Feiyu is small in stature, short and chubby, with black hair combed into small buns, and paired with a pair of round big eyes. Her pink and tender looks like a baby doll. Furthermore, the eldest brother and sister Law are the pillars of the Zhan family, and the young Yao family is not too narrow-minded to stare at half a peach without letting go. On the other hand, she treats Zhan Feiyu, the eldest niece, quite well, at least verbally. Here you are." Zhan Feiyu handed the peach over without hesitation. Sanlang snatched the peach and stuffed it into his mouth. At such a fast pace, his nails brushed over Zhan Feiyu's chubby hand, leaving 2 red marks in an instant. "Xiaoyu, Sanlang is only 2 months younger than you. Don't get used to him. Did you win this?" Xiaoyao's smile became even more genuine. What she couldn't hear clearly in the room just now was mainly a mix of 6 or 7 children. Auntie, I ran the fastest and won." Ernyo straightened his sturdy small chest, with a peach in his mouth, and his saliva almost flowed as he spoke. Xiao Yao listened to the whole process of eating peaches in the game from the mouths and tongues of Ernyo and Shan Wazi, her eyes flickering shrewdly, and her face, which was marked by pockmarks and black spots, deepened her smile a bit. Zhan Feiyu refilled some water, squatted by the wooden bucket to wash his hands, looked up at Aunt Air, and half of the plan was successful. It's late in summer, and usually after dinner, the villagers like to come out to cool off, either by the stream at the village entrance or under the big banyan tree in the middle of the village. However, tonight, the family of Shangzhan didn't come out after tidying up their dishes. "Mom, I think both Erlang and Sanlang want to go to school, but our family can't afford to pay for their studies. In September, we can only send one to a private school. Why don't we let the children have a comparison, and whichever is more clever, we can start school first. Next year, we will go to the county to work part-time and earn money. All our children will be sent to private schools." As soon as Xiao Yao spoke these words, the Zhan family, who had only gathered at noon, fell into contemplation. Mr. Zhan took 2 puffs of dry tobacco and nodded in agreement. This method is not bad. They are all grandsons of the Zhan family. It's the same who goes to a private school, Erlang and Sanlang. But Zhan doesn't want the second and third families to argue about this matter again. There were already some gaps before, and if it were to stir up trouble again, the family wouldn't have peace. It was also laughed at by the villagers when it came out. The competition for admission is the most fair, and even the losers have no words to make a fuss. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Calculation of Second Room. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3 Calculation of Second Room. Mrs. Zhan half squinted her eyes and didn't speak. In private, she planned to let the second son from the third house go to a private school. After all, the second house already had a wealthy man, and it was time for the third family. Moreover, Mrs. Zhan loved her youngest son the most. But equally, she also loved her great-grandson. During this time, Zhan Daolong has been coaxing old lady Zhan a lot. In addition, the second daughter-in-law is the niece of her mother's family, and old lady Zhan hesitated. She nodded in agreement. Xiao Yao was overjoyed, and his eyes flashed. He glanced at his uninterested elder brother and sister-in-law, and Yu Guang paused on the small stool as Zhan Feiyu continued with a smile, "Mom and Dad, your palms and backs are all flesh. Since you want to compare, why not let Xiao Yu join in? Xiao Yu looks smart at first glance. If you can read in the future, maybe you can even marry into the county." Boss Zhan was taken aback for a moment, and Li was also surprised. Looking at Xiao Yao, who was showing goodwill, he felt a little relieved in his heart. Although De Fong has no son, the couple who contribute the most to the Zhan family are their husband and wife. They will be remembered by the family for their kindness, and they will be happy no matter what. Suddenly clenching his meaty little fist, Zhan Feiyu lifted his head with a bewildered and surprised expression on his face. He seemed to not understand that this matter of entering the private school was also related to himself. He said in a daze, "If I win, I will go to the private school." Although both Mr. Zhan and Mrs. Zhan are biased towards their grandchildren, they also love their granddaughter, Zhan Feiyu. They are used to her clever appearance in their daily lives. They would look at her sitting on a small stool with her head tilted back, her big black eyes widened like a cat, and her silly and cute appearance made the Zhan family in the hall laugh. Zhan Laosan laughed heartily and raised his hand to flick Zhan Feiyu's forehead. He lifted the person up and said, "Yes, if Xiao Yu wins, uncle will send you to a private school to study." Zhan Feiyu appears clever and intelligent among children of the same age, but after all, she is a little girl. She learns needlework and then follows Zhan old man to learn a few dishes on the stove. When she gets married at the age of 14 or 15, she will get married in 2 years. This is the path that all little girls in Jinlin village will follow. Go to a private school to study. 20 or 30 households in the village who are wealthier than the Zhan family did not send their daughter to school. This is just a joke, just for fun. The competition was settled for 10 days, and Erlang, Sanlang, and Zhan Feiyu had no better memory than anyone else. Zhan Daolang spends half an hour every day teaching 3 people to recite the 3-character classic. 10 days later, the one who memorizes the most fluently will win. At night, the cicadas stopped chirping, and the scorching heat of the day dissipated. Every household also turned off their oil lamps. Zhan's family has 3 bedrooms. Ma, who couldn't sleep in bed, rolled over and pushed Zhan Laosan's back, muttering, "What are you saying about second sister-in-law's plans? Little fish is so smart. If only little fish could carry it, wouldn't it really be a waste of money to let the girl go to a private school?" As soon as Zhan Laosan fell asleep, he was pushed awake and angrily moved outside the bed. He blurted out, "Whatever you do, whoever wins will go." "You." Ma glared angrily, but on second thought, he became happy again. His own Erlang was much stronger than Sanlang. Even if Xiaoyu went to a private school, it would be better to make Erfang proud. Ma relaxed his mind and fell asleep for a moment with his eyes closed. The second and third rooms of the Zhan family are also 3 rooms, and a wooden room has been built in front of the osmanthus tree by the wall. This is the study of Dalang. After cutting the wick, the study lit up a bit. Xiao Yao reminded Dalang, who had put down the book, again, "Remember to secretly teach San Lang to memorize a few more times starting from tomorrow." "Mom, I'm not stupid." The young man impatiently looked at his mother who had said it 5 times. Erlang was his cousin, Sanlang was his younger brother, and Zhan Daolang knew he could help his own brother even if he had no brains. Xiao Yao pursed her lips and smiled, with a proud expression on her face. "Okay, Mom won't bother you with your studies," she said after returning to the bedroom. Seeing Zhan Lao sitting on the bed shaking a fan, Xiao Yao's face smiled even more. She praised him, "Is this method I thought of today good? When my third son wins, the third wife can't talk about this anymore." Xiao Yao sat intimately by the edge of the bed, imagining that her 2 sons had both studied and would become successful in the future. She would become an old lady of the official family, not to mention the Zhan family, and the entire village would rely on her son's support. Sanlang is intelligent, but he has a wild and playful personality. After entering school, he asked Master Lin to discipline him more. Xiao Yao paused and looked at Zhan Lauer with a puzzled expression. "What are you doing to get Xiaoyu involved? That girl is a thief. Our 2 sons need to have a good appearance, a brain, and a natural destiny of being an official." However, even though Xiao Yao is usually proud, she knows that Zhan Feiyu, the big niece, is not foolish. She just refuses to admit that a girl is stronger than her own son. Zhan Lao half squinted his eyes and Lao Shen spoke up, "Erlang and Sanlang are both big brother's nephews, but don't forget that sister.in.law's surname is Li, and we still have big brother and sister.in.law to support us at home. Reluctance and willingness are different." "That's right, sister.in.law looks friendly, but she's very shrewd." Xiao Yao pouted in dissatisfaction. Among the 3 daughters-in-law of the Zhan family, the Li family is definitely the best in terms of reputation. She has a kind temper, a kind heart, and is quick and capable. If she fails, she will be defeated and will not give birth to a son. Otherwise, this admission quota would definitely be for a wealthy family. Zhan Lauer smiled shrewdly and explained calmly as he looked at his wife with a tense face, "As long as Big Brother faces home. Big Brother has a stubborn temper and needs to smooth things out, but no matter how good the brotherly relationship is, it cannot be compared to that between husband and wife on a daily basis." Zhan also noticed some signs, so Xiao Yao brought up the competition because of dividing the peach. Zhan carefully considered and added Zhan Feiyu, his niece, as well. The sister.in.law felt relieved. With this premise in mind, in the future, the elder brother will work tirelessly to support his nephew's education. Even if the sister.in.law breathes a sigh of relief, Zhan heir will not be afraid. Moreover, parents don't have to make things difficult anymore. A bowl of water is even, and all three sons are treated fairly without any favoritism. As for which room in the private world took advantage and benefited, Zhan Lauer's shining eyes showed a hint of greed and self-satisfaction, which was his personal ability. Zhan Lauer, who was quite impeccable, put down his fan and lay down, anxiously admonishing Xiaoyao, starting tomorrow, you should keep an eye on Sanlang. Erlang has a calm temperament and is much more patient than Sanlang. Alright, I know. If I let De Lang secretly teach me, Sanlang will definitely win. The smile on Xiaoyao's face couldn't be suppressed, wishing that 10 days would come in a blink of an eye. No matter how smart and calm Erlang is, after all, he is an 8-year-old child, and no one can teach him how to win. At midnight, the entire Jinlin village fell silent. Zhan Feiyu got up from her small bed. Yesterday, she deliberately played the game of eating peaches, which was determined by the clever calculation of her uncle and aunt. They would definitely take action if they were touched. The wooden door creaked, but fortunately, my parents had been working hard all day and slept soundly at night. Zhan Feiyu sneaked out of the door, and the big yellow dog in the yard wagged its tail and lay on the ground docile. Zhan Dalong had already returned to his room to sleep, and the small study was not locked. After Zhan Feiyu sneaked in, he picked up the Enlightenment, 3-character classic, handwritten on the table under the moonlight, and then took Qiongling of Preschool Education from the simple bookshelf. He walked out of the Zhan family courtyard with short legs. The big yellow dog immediately followed and walked towards the forest behind the village, one by one. On the slope on the right side of the mountain forest, there is a towering rock that looks like a barrier. It not only blocks the Zhanfei fish nestled behind, but also tightly blocks the candle light. Zhan Feiyu lit the candle he brought out and placed it in the groove under the rock. With the moonlight and candlelight, he quickly opened the 3-character classic and read it thoroughly. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. I encourage me to go. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. I encourage me to go. Zhan Feiyu has been sneaking out to read books since he was 3 years old, and it has been 4 years now. Zhan Dalong is 12 years old this year and enrolled in school at the age of 8. He has also studied in a private school for 4 years. The Zhan family is frugal and has bought back the 3-character classic, 100 family surnames, 1000-character one, which were used for enlightenment, as well as the 4 books and 5 classics for the Imperial examination. Zhan Dalong is now able to read all 4 books, and memorization is not a viable option. Even if he tries to paste poetry, he can write a catchy rhyme. However, old lady Zhan doted on her grandson and believed that Zhan Dalong was intelligent. She would rather spend a lot of money to let him participate in the child health examination. Unfortunately, she did not pass the first county examination in February this year, let alone the provincial examination. The 3 talents, heaven, earth, and humanity. The 3 lights, sun, moon, and stars. The 3 principles, righteousness of rulers and officials. The soft and sticky recitation sound rang out, while the big yellow dog lying at Zhan Feiyu's feet suddenly stood up and let out a guarded sob towards the depths of the forest. Zhan Feiyu was startled and turned around to look back. The rhubarb was alert to danger and barked fiercely. Suddenly, there was only a sound of hoops, and something cut through the night sky. The rhubarb let out a painful whimper and fell to the ground with a loud bang. "Rhubarb!" exclaimed in surprise. Zhan Feiyu's eyes widened and he quickly squatted down. Little chubby hands touched Rhubarb's body, and the undulating abdomen under his palm made her know that Rhubarb had just fainted. The moonlight was dim and unclear, and Zhan Feiyu, squatting next to the rhubarb, didn't have time to get up when he saw a figure walking out of the dark forest. The newcomer was dressed in a black cross-lapel robe, with a slender figure and a face that was not weak enough to be between a teenager and a youth. However, his facial features were stern and cold, and his narrow phoenix eyes were even more chilling, exuding a bloody and murderous aura. At this moment, his heart beat like a drum, and under the terror, Zhan Feiyu instinctively held his breath, and his entire body's hair stood up. The black figure approached, and his lifelike gaze made Zhan Feiyu's legs soften, causing him to fall and sit down. In summer, his clothes were thin, and a protruding stone hit the middle of his buttocks. Ah! His facial features were twisted, and Zhan Feiyu changed from a sitting posture to kneeling on both knees. He quickly covered his buttocks with both hands and rubbed them, which was extremely painful. Nguyen's gaze swept over the three-character classic that had fallen to the ground, and then fell on Zhan Feiyu's twisted and chubby face. The pain was severe, and his delicate facial features formed a vicious mass. Sakura red lips pouted together, constantly gasping for breath. The night breeze brought a refreshing breeze, but the smell of blood drifted by with the wind. Zhan Feiyu's rubbing of his buttocks paused, lifted his eyelids, and carefully glanced. In an instant, his little heart was about to stop in fear. Under the pale moonlight, the silver sword in the opponent's hand shone brightly, with crimson blood dripping from the tip of the sword. Zhan Feiyu's mind was spinning rapidly. He was only 7 years old, but he was small and looked like he was only 5 or 6 years old. He was still a little kid, maybe he could get by. A little kid who sneaks into the mountains to study in the middle of the night. Zhan Feiyu swallowed his saliva and gritted his teeth. He couldn't pass the scam, admitted. Big brother. Looking up, Zhan Feiyu grinned, his eyebrows curved, his black and moist eyes resembling crushed stars. Big brother, my name is Zhan Feiyu. I'm 7 years old and my family is poor. So I stole the Tang Ji's book and came out to read it. Be frank and lenient. Zhan Feiyu climbed up from the ground with both hands and feet, pulling at the wound behind his buttocks, and his chubby face twisted into a ball. Holding back the pain, Zhan Feiyu revealed a mouthful of white teeth, trying to make himself look silly and cute. The soft and sticky voice of the child resounded firmly, Big brother, don't worry, I can keep secrets the best. Not hearing the famous saying, only the dead can keep secrets, Zhan Feiyu, whose smiling cheeks were sore, breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that his life might have been saved. The wind stopped and the mountains and forests were quiet. Zhan Feiyu's heart, which had just let go, rubbed against it and then picked it up again. This silent silence was more chilling than sound, and his back felt chills. After waiting for a while, Zhan Feiyu gritted his scalp and lifted his head, moving slowly as if he could hear the sound of his neck bone cracking and lifting. Faced with Nguyen's phoenix-like eyes, Zhan Feiyu's stiff body trembled with fear. In front of the real strong, whether pretending to be cowardly or deceiving, it was actually a sense of confusion. The other party wielded swords, and his own life was entrusted here. Looking at the chubby girl who was about to turn into a ball, Nguyen lifted his thin lips and said, "Get lost." The deliberately lowered male voice sounded a bit strange, but in Zhan Feiyu's ears, it sounded like a heavenly melody. The tense Baozi face instantly burst into surprise and excitement. I'll go now. The speed was unprecedented. Zhan Feiyu turned around and picked up 2 books. With one hand, he grabbed the blown-out candle, and the burning tears fell on the back of his hand. Zhan Feiyu's grinning, numb eggs, and pain were negligible compared to his little life. As soon as he turned around, he saw the rhubarb on the ground. Zhan Feiyu, who wanted to roll, was dumbfounded. The rhubarb had just fainted, so it shouldn't be dangerous. But what if it turned into charcoal grilled dog meat? After hesitating for a while, Zhan Feiyu stuffed the book in his hand into his collar, and half of the candle was also stuffed under the stone. With a grit of his teeth, his thick arm, like a lotus root, suddenly exerted force, and Zhan Feiyu picked up the rhubarb on the ground. Rhubarb is going to lose weight. Xiao Pang's face turned red, and Zhan Feiyu exerted all his strength to suckle. He then picked up a 30.40-pound rhubarb and stumbled away. As Zhan Feiyu left, a figure silently stood behind Nguyen, staring blankly at the chubby girl who was hunched over and holding onto the big yellow dog, leaving. Could it be that he was so cruel that he didn't even let go of a dog? 10, 9, 8. Zhan Feiyu relaxed his grip and the rhubarb fell to the ground with a thud. The rhubarb, still fainting, let out a vague moan. Zhan Feiyu was panting heavily, and his chubby paws grabbed onto De Huang's front leg and dragged him forward. Seventh Lord, this chubby girl is quite righteous, the young man chuckled, scared enough but didn't leave his dog behind. 1 step, 2 steps. Zhan Feiyu dragged the rhubarb to the tree more than a foot away, exhausted his strength, and with a release of his hands, the muffled sound of the heavy object landing began. Zhan Feiyu rushed down the mountain slope with all his might, like a small beast. In the blink of an eye, Pang Dundan's body disappeared into the darkness, and De Huang, who had been knocked unconscious by stones, lay alone under the tree roots. The young man felt his face swollen with a slap, and he said he would never leave. Just threw it away and ran away without loyalty. From beginning to end, Yin Wuyan's young yet indifferent face showed no change in expression. Go check, he said, yes. Upon hearing his own master's rough voice during the changing period, the young man suppressed his smile and disappeared into the dark mountains. If it weren't for this chubby girl, the master hadn't spoken for half a month. Lying back on his wooden bed, Zhan Feiyu, who had narrowly escaped death, hugged the pillow in his arms, and the black figure involuntarily appeared in his mind. Compared to the 16 or 17-year-old stunned youths in the village, that person was just like the king of hell in the underworld. With his indifferent and ruthless gaze, his fierce and unyielding aura, Zhan Feiyu's small body trembled. He didn't want to, went to sleep. There was nothing to do overnight, and the sun rose high. Upon hearing the footsteps coming from outside, Li, who was busy in the kitchen, couldn't help but laugh and said, "You lazy girl, you only get up when the sun shines on your buttocks." "Mom, there were mosquito bites at night, and I didn't sleep well." Zhan Feiyu grinned and touched his hungry stomach. "Mom, do you have anything to eat?" Li opened the kitchen door and handed Zhan Feiyu a fist-sized coarse grain mantou. "Go out to eat, it's hot here." "I'll go to play with the mountain kids," Zhan Feiyu said vaguely while chewing mantou. People had already run to the kitchen door. Seeing the rhubarb wagging its tail in the yard, Zhan Feiyu's fat face smiled more brightly. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Rumors and Rumors. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Rumors and Rumors. The big banyan tree in the middle of the village is thick and tall, and the wind brings waves of coolness. Children gather under the shade of the tree to play. The mountain boy who was squatting on the ground throwing stones looked up at the red marks left by the bamboo mat on Zhan Feiyu's face and laughed heartily. "Little fish, you slept until the sun dried your buttocks." Zhan Feiyu puts the last mantou into her mouth. Her white and tender cheeks are puffy, and her big black round eyes look cute and charming. Wu Tsuetsue looked at Zhan Feiyu with a slanted gaze, raised her slender eyebrows in disgust, and sneered in a sharp voice, "You're really lazy. You can't even be found in 10 miles or 8 villages like this." The 7-year-old girl is neither too big nor too small. She helps feed the chickens at home, uproots the wild grass in the vegetable field, and diligently sweeps the floor, selects vegetables, and takes care of her younger siblings. She can even cook and stir-fry on a small stool. "Wu Tsuetsue, how are you talking?" Shenhuazi rubbed herself up and stood up, her dark and sturdy body blocking Zhan Feiyu's face. She angrily retorted, "Did Xiaoyu drink your water? Did she eat your rice?" Ernyo's eyes widened, fierce and savage like a little calf, and he cursed back fiercely, "Wu Tsuetsue, you're just a dog with a mouse meddling in your own business. You envy the little fish for being more beautiful and smarter than you. You're all blind." A sharp scream sounded, and Wu Tsuetsue's angry eyes turned red. She crossed her waist with one hand and pointed at Zhan Feiyu, shouting, "She's lazy and fat, where's she beautiful? Compared with Zhan Feiyu, who is short and fat, Wu Cuizui is also 7 years old, but she is tall and has a beautiful face. Her dark hair is braided into a fried dough twists braid. She is tied with a bright red headband and a half-open magnolia flower. Wu Cuizui, ugly 8 monsters. Wu Cuizui, cursor. The cursor is crying. The mischievous Ernyo and Shan Wazi laughed triumphantly, while a group of bear kids had no aesthetic sense. In their eyes, Zhan Feiyu was their own person, and no one could bully him. Being defended by his buddies, Zhan Feiyu laughed and explained his intention in a crisp voice, Ernyo, let me tell you that I won't come out to play for the next 10 days. My big brother is going to teach me, Lang, and San Lang how to read. Xiaoyu, why are you reading? Ernyo's head was as big as a hemp, and he would rather follow his father to work in the fields than read and recognize characters. Shenwazi also asked, Little fish, my mother said she will send me to a private school in September, and we will go together then. Zhan Feiyu didn't hide anything and quickly and concisely recounted the competition, ensuring that Shenwazi and the others could accurately tell the beginning and end when they returned. Shenwazi's eyes lit up and she slammed her chest, making a mesmerizing and confident prophecy. Little fish, you must win. A group of buddies nodded like a chicken pecking at rice. The little fish was the smartest cub in the village. She ranked second, but no one dared to rank first. Wu Cuizui stared enviously at Zhan Feiyu, who was surrounded by her friends in the middle, her eyes turning red with anger. The old Wu family gave birth to 3 daughters. Wu Cuizui was the youngest and favored by the family. Coupled with her beautiful face, Wu's father sent Wu Cuizui to a private school last year. Wu's father is a butcher who owns a meat stall in the county. After reading for a few years, he has gained a lot of knowledge and plans to teach Wu Cuizui how to read and find a good husband's family in the county in the future. The families in the county who run shops, whose daughter-in-law doesn't know a few words, not only knows how to do business but also knows how to keep accounts. Unfortunately, after staying for a month, Wu Cuizui came back crying and refused to go to a private school. I'll go back and endorse it. When I win, I'll buy you 3 lotus root candies to eat, 1 person. Zhan Feiyu waved goodbye to his friend and went home. Stepping on her short legs and looking at the bumpy dirt road beneath her feet, Zhan Feiyu let out a long sigh. Her fair and chubby little face showed an adult-like seriousness and heaviness, not her own petty heart, but she had to guard against it. Allowing oneself to participate in the competition is just the second uncle's plan. He wants to silence his parents and convince the big house to provide the second room with education. If he wins in the end, Uncle Heir will definitely not give up. The family will only let Erlang or Sanlang go to a private school. So Zhan Feiyu can only make the competition a big fuss, and when the time comes, considering the face of the Zhan family, they can only acknowledge it by pinching their noses. Whether it's the idle effect of Zhan Feiyu or the bear child's craving for lotus root candy, by the evening, every household knows about the competition between the 3 children of Lao Zhan's family. Under the big banyan tree, the cool aunts and daughter-in-law shook their cattail fans to drive away mosquitoes and talked about it with all sorts of chatter. Second sister-in-law, reading and reading are all male children's affairs. Do you really plan to let Xiaoyu go to a private school in your old Zhan family? Xiao Yao's eyes flickered with a gentle smile as she raised her eyebrows and said, they are all poor and mischievous. My second son said that the girls in the county town are all pampered, and each one can read and write. Big brother and sister-in-law only have a child, and parents also said they want a bowl of water to be even. Zhan Erge is delivering goods in the county town, and his vision is really different. The young daughter-in-law flattered a few words, with a fawning smile on her face. De Lang is smart, and San Lang's younger brother is definitely not bad. San Lang can't compare to his brother, he knows how to eat all day. Xiao Yao shook her head humbly, but her eyes showed a hint of complacency. Compared to men who only know how to scrape food in the fields, their own men are much more shrewd, especially when they have become sworn brothers with Constable Ma. The villagers have to come to their own men to discuss everything they encounter. Originally, the competition between the Zhan family was only talked about by the children of Erniu, but the little Yao who took a cold last night also admitted it. The men in charge of the village naturally knew about it, but they didn't take it seriously. In the end, this competition was only about the Zhan family's heir Lang and San Lang. Zhan Feiyu was just a piece of cake. Shaanxi County, in 7th Master. A black figure silently appeared in the guest room and whispered to Yin Wuyen, who was sitting upright by the window, "That little girl is the daughter of the Zhan family in Jinlin village. She is 7 years old this year." Yin Wuyen's gloomy gaze fell on the scroll in his hand, and under the dim light of the candle, his pale face was unusually cold. The young man couldn't help but laugh when he thought about the investigation. "I thought that chubby girl was only 5 years old, but she was already 7 years old. She's only growing flesh and not a head." He said. "The children from rural families don't have enough to eat and wear, and they are basically thin and small with a withered appearance. Zhan Feiyu is short, but she is fat." When the young man thought of her chubby bun face, paired with a pair of round black big eyes, a three-headed body, and short legs, it didn't look like she was short and hungry no matter what. It was likely that her flesh had grown on her face. "7th Master, you don't know this girl has too many careful eyes." The young man chattered out Zhan Feiyu's little plans and said with a loud smile, "Now the whole village knows about the Zhan family competition. This chubby girl is trying to use public opinion to force the Zhan family to allow her to win and enter a private school." Just as the young man thought his 7th Master wouldn't pay attention to him, his rough voice sounded sarcastically, "Draw water from a bamboo basket." The young man was taken aback and stared at Yin Wuyen with a cold expression. After the 7th Prince changed his voice, he wouldn't speak for a month because that chubby girl, the 7th Prince, had opened his mouth last night and tonight. Does 7th Lord also like to listen to gossip? The young man walked excitedly closer to the window and spoke excitedly, 7th Lord, that chubby girl is only 7 years old. It would be wise to think of this method, but she didn't know that people's hearts are dangerous. Compared to money and interests, reputation, human nature, and family affection are nothing. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Recitation Progress. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6 Recitation Progress. The lights were as bright as day, and Yin Wuyen continued to read, seemingly not hearing the young man's overly excited words. After waiting for a while without a response, the young man rubbed his stiff face with a smile and realized that he was foolish. It's already raining red rain from the sky that the 7th Prince can speak up. Do you still expect the cold-hearted 7th Prince to lend a helping hand to a chubby girl? As time passed, there was only a faint sound of pages flipping in the room. The young man quickly picked a candle wick upon seeing this, and the room became slightly brighter. Chen Weibin, the magistrate of Shaanxi County, was a jinshi in the 2nd year of Daqing, and his advisor was Lu Jian, the left Imperial censor. Yin Wuyen's hoarse voice disrupted the silence of the guest room. The young man was taken aback for a moment, and when it came to serious matters, he also restrained his gossiping expression. He replied with a serious tone, "Yes, the Ministry of Personnel has passed the exams twice in a row, and it is clear that Lu Jian, the stubborn old man, is suppressing Chen Weibin's promotion. The term of office for local officials in the Daqing dynasty was once every 3 years, and it was entrusted to the Ministry of Personnel for inspection. The inspection results were divided into 3 levels. Upper, middle, and lower, which determined the promotion and retention of local officials. Chen Weibin has been in Shaanxi County for 7 years and has achieved remarkable political achievements. According to theory, even if he is not promoted, he should be transferred to other major counties. Unfortunately, he is only a 7th-grade county magistrate, while his mentor Lu Jian is a 2nd-grade official. At the Jinluan Hall back then, Chen Weibin openly opposed his master and caused Lu Jian to vomit blood and faint. Not to mention being suppressed for 7 years, it was normal to be suppressed for 17 years. Even if Lu Jian became an official, there was still Lu Changyuan, the eldest son of the left assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, in the court. Chen Weibin was afraid of dying in his old age at the position of Shaanxi County Magistrate. Yin Wuyan's slender fingers lightly tapped on the table, his young face pale in color, and his voice even more cold and heartless. The newly appointed governor of Nanchuan's decree is to marry the daughter of the Kong family. Ah! The young man blinked his eyes in a daze. What does seventh master mean by his endless words? I wanted to ask, but my seventh master was already focused on reading. The young man frowned and racked his brains, thinking for a long time. After a while, his eyes lit up and he said, "Seventh master, I understand. I'm going to do it now." Noisy. The cold sound of expulsion sounded, and Yin Wuyan glanced coldly. The young man shamelessly smiled and pushed open the window, his tall figure disappearing into the night. In the evening, green smoke had already emitted from the chimneys of every household in Jinlin village, and the sound of Lang Lang's books spread through the walls of the Zhan family, making passing villagers unable to help but glance and talking about the 3 children of the Zhan family's competition recitation. The smell is scorched and rotten. These 5 odors are smelled by the nose. Pao Tu Gu. Sanlang's voice became quieter and he took a sniff. He stretched his neck and looked towards the kitchen, which was filled with the fragrance of rice. He stuttered and repeated, "Pao Tu Gu. Gu. You're a pig, you know how to eat and eat all day long." Zhan Dalang angrily slapped Zhan Sanlang on the head with a loud slap, the strength of which can be imagined. Lin Fuzi's daily arrangement of big characters and memorization has not been completed yet, so he still needs to spend half an hour teaching Zhan Feiyu 3. That's all. Xiao Yao even asked Zhan Dalang to secretly teach his younger son to memorize for another half an hour every night. It's only been 3 days now, and Zhan Dalang has already become impatient. Unfortunately, Zhan Sanlang's back is not as smooth as Zhan Feiyu and Erlang duo, and not as smooth as the 2 of them. When he thinks of his parents muttering, Zhan Dalang's angry gaze glares at his useless little brother. Zhan Sanlang's stomach was so hungry that he was slapped again. In anger, he pushed Zhan Dalang away and ran away shouting, "I won't carry it, I won't carry it." Pao Tu Gu, wood, stone, gold. Silk and bamboo are 8 tones. They are called Ping Shang and Go In. These 4 tones should be coordinated. Big brother, I can recite them proficiently. Zhan Erlang finished this passage proficiently. Unlike Zhan Dalao's high-eyed and impatient nature, nor Zhan Sanlang's accustomed wild and mischievous nature, Zhan Erlang is simple and honest, has a good memory, and is also intelligent. The progress of his recitation in the past 3 days has already surpassed that of Sanlang, who started a small kitchen. Seeing that De Tanggu ignored Tanggu, Zhan Feiyu smiled at Lang and continued to recite, "Great ancestor, father is the body. Brother is a friend, brother is respectful. Elderly and young preface, friend is a friend. June is respectful, minister is loyal. These 10 righteousness are shared by everyone. When teaching, do not violate. Alright, you guys carry it on your own. I'm going to finish the homework assigned by Master Lin." Zhan Dalang looked at Zhan Feiyu and Zhan Erlang with a gloomy expression, then turned around and walked towards the study. The jealousy on his face couldn't be concealed. If he had such a good memory, he wouldn't have been afraid of Master Lin's back twitching. In the kitchen, the 3 daughters-in-law of the Zhan family were all busy at the stove, but their ears were all perked up listening to the outside recitation. Xiao Yao couldn't maintain his usual hypocrisy. With a black face, he stuffed a piece of firewood into the stove, hoping to rush out and catch his young son who had run away and beat him up. Ma put down his kitchen knife, put the cut sweet potato vines into a bowl, and proudly glanced at Xiao Yao, deliberately raising his voice to praise, "Sister-in-law, Xiaoyu has a really good memory, but my Erlang is not bad either." The stove was burning fiercely, and it was about to burn in a while. Li quickly stir-fried the green peppers a few times and put them on a plate. With a smile, he continued, "Little fish speaks early and remembers things early." "Yeah, I think this competition must be won by Xiaoyu," Xiaoyao said with a smirk on her face, with a gloomy look in her eyes, mocking her. No matter how smart she wasn't a leader. There are still 2 grandchildren in the Zhan family, so it's never the turn of the girl to go to the private school. Zhan Feiyu, this dead girl, winning is useless. At this thought, Xiaoyao's chest relaxed a bit, but at the thought of his inexperienced son, his old face stretched longer. Ma was mentioned by Zhan Laosan before, and his own Erlang was much stronger than Sanlang. Xiaoyu was also a girl, and it was definitely Erlang who went to the private school in the end. Upon this thought, Ma suddenly regained his energy and chopped the kitchen knife with a thud. "Sister-in-law, take a break and I'll make the rest," he said. "No, there's only 1 dish left." Thinking of Mana's culinary skills, which even pigs don't eat, Li quickly washed the pot without intending to let her waste the food. After the busy farming season, there was not much work to do in the field. Old Zhan was resting at home, while old Zhan slipped out early in the morning to play. He didn't even come back for lunch, so old Zhan worked tirelessly in the field until the sun set. The 3 brothers met at the entrance. "Third, where have you been again? Don't you know how to help your elder brother in the fields?" Zhan II, who got off the ox cart, scolded Zhan III with his older brother's airs. Zhan Laosan, who had a mischievous temperament, smiled shamelessly and said, "There's not much work in the field, big brother is enough alone." With these words, he felt embarrassed and rushed into the yard like a wild monkey. Zhan Laoer turned his head to look at Zhan Laoda with a respectful and concerned attitude. "Big brother, don't get used to Lao San. When you should scold, you should scold. Erlang is already at the age of studying, and he's still like a young boy who hasn't grown up. It's okay, I can handle it." Mr. Zhan spoke nonchalantly, but his younger brother, the second brother, cared about him. Mr. Zhan was also happy in his heart, but his face was always cold and hard, and he couldn't see any emotional changes. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Calculation of Second Room. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7 Calculation of Second Room. Dad, you're back. Upon hearing the sound of words at the entrance of the courtyard, Zhan Feiyu ran over with short legs and a crisp voice rang out. "Dad, I've memorized the 3-character classic, the most and fluently, and I'm about to finish it all. I don't care if Mr. Zhan's body is covered in mud." Mr. Zhan Feiyu hugged Mr. Zhan's legs, tilted his head back and grinned, his black and plump eyes full of adorable praise. Mr. Zhan's cold and hard expression softened, and he even laughed. His rough big hand touched Zhan Feiyu's small head and said, "What a good fish." Zhan Feiyu's eyes were wide open with a smile, but Yu Guang glanced over and saw his second uncle unloading the ox cart without even looking at him. "Yo, Xiaoyu is so smart. Erlang, you've been outdone by your younger sister." Zhan Laosan, who had washed his face with well water in the yard, chuckled and patted his son's shoulder. Then he picked up Zhan Feiyu and raised him high. "When Xiaoyu goes to the private school, maybe she will take the female scholar exam for our old Zhan family and come back." Being lifted up by the uncle, Zhan Feiyu looked at his second uncle again and, yes, missed his momentary gloomy expression. In the past few days, the Zhan family has been paying attention to the progress of the 3 children's endorsements. Sanlang has a wild and impatient personality, forgetting the back and the front. Aunt Air was so angry that she beat Sanlang up a few times. Although Uncle Air didn't say anything, his face has always been ugly. Zhan Feiyu had a premonition that Uncle Air and Aunt Air must have a plan. At night, after taking a shower and sitting on the bed, Zhan Feiyu recited the 3-character classic he had learned during the day. He then looked at Li Shi, who was wiping his cool mat, and said, "I've memorized the most. Mom, do you think I can go to a private school?" With her back to her daughter, Li's wiping of the mat froze and she quickly wiped it a few times before turning back to look at her daughter sitting on the chair with her short legs swaying. Under the dim light of the candle, Zhan Feiyu draped her hair and had a small face that was set off as white and tender. Her bright and adorable gaze softened Li's heart. Li threw the cloth towel in her hand into the wooden basin and glanced at Zhan Dalong's study in the courtyard through the window paper. Her friendly expression always cooled a bit. "Little fish, even if you win, your second uncle and second aunt won't let you go to a private school," she said. "Li has a gentle personality and does not argue with others, but she is not foolish. The second husband and wife are both selfish and scheming, and they say beautiful things one after another, but the benefits are all wrapped up in their own room. Only their own men value this second brother and cannot see his true face." In recent years, the Li family has also been playing it by ear, but Mr. Zhan is stubborn and defends his second brother from the bottom of his heart. Moreover, he is usually a trivial matter, and Mr. Zhan is also a talkative person. No matter how much Li talks, it's like drawing water from a bamboo basket. Upon hearing his own mother's words, Zhan Feiyu's heart sank for a moment. He lowered his head and looked at his chubby hands, muttering unwillingly, "Mother, everyone in the village is talking about the competition. Grandpa has good face, is he not keeping his word?" When Nyo said the competition, they all came to see. Before, Zhan Feiyu deliberately promoted the competition to his friends, hoping to use public opinion to seek a fair and just result. Grandpa has good face, and Uncle Air is no exception. Silly girl, the villagers are just talking behind their backs. No one will gossip in front of your grandfather. Li Shi touched Zhan Feiyu's head with heartache, feeling suffocated and uncomfortable, but still patiently explained in a warm voice. A private school costs 10 taels of silver for annual maintenance, not to mention the usual 3 festivals gifts, as well as pens, ink, paper, and inkstones. Even if your second aunt goes all out to tear your face, she won't let you go. Your second uncle is also shrewd, and when the time comes, your grandparents will definitely be convinced by one set of excuses. Xiaoyu is so smart. Li, who is a mother, knows better than anyone else, but unfortunately she is a girl. What Li didn't say was that his own man had weak ears and no independent opinions, while his second wife was full of bad luck and unreasonable behavior. In the end, the second wife benefited, but he was afraid that his own man would still be the one to fall for it. Zhan Feiyu tightly clenched his chubby hands. Even if his mother didn't say anything, she knew that his second uncle had a selfish personality. However, she didn't want to miss the opportunity to attend a private school. If she missed this time, she was afraid of not having another chance in the future. Zhan Feiyu lowered his head and bit his lips, thinking. Although his father indulged him, he would definitely turn to his second uncle and listen to his opinions on big matters. After all, he was only 7 years old, and no adult or elder would care about a yellow-haired girl's words. As for his own mother, Zhan Feiyu looked up at Li Shi's slightly tense face and couldn't help feeling sad. He grabbed Li Shi's rough hands with his small hand and said with a blocked throat, "Mother, don't feel uncomfortable. I'll be fine when I grow up." Li Shi forced herself to smile, not wanting to disappoint her daughter. She promised with a smile, "Mom, I will buy you paper and pens. We, little fish, are smart and can learn to write at home." Mother, I must be stronger than the Lang San Lang." Zhan Feiyu pounced and hugged Li Shi, feeling uncomfortable. Mother had been holding back for years and would only feel even worse. Unfortunately, father always thought that second uncle was good, so mother could only complain to herself. Although it's all minor matters of family background, the more times it happens, the more blunt the knife cuts the flesh. Zhan Feiyu knows that the second wife has always been taking advantage of the situation, and her mother is also transparent and shrewd. For the sake of her father and herself, she can only turn a blind eye as if she doesn't know. As soon as I thought about how my parents had worked hard to earn enough money to support De Lang's education, if De Lang were diligent and eager to learn, Zhan Feiyu would also accept it. However, De Lang's education was just a waste of money, and in the future, there might be another San Lang. Zhan Feiyu closed his eyes to cover up his unwillingness and helplessness. On the other hand, Xiaoyao harshly scolded his mischievous son and forced him to follow behind the young man, reciting his words and returning to the room with an unyielding anger. Second, what if Xiaoyu wins? Xiaoyao closed the door and yelled anxiously, wishing he could have fooled Zhan Feiyu with a hammer, so that no one could snatch the opportunity for San Lang to enroll. Zhan Lauer had just taken a shower and was now lying in bed, half squinting his eyes to rest. Upon hearing this, he couldn't help but laugh sarcastically, his shrewd face full of indifference. What are you in a hurry? This is San Lang's opportunity, and no one can take it away. Zhan Lauer casually opened his eyes, showing disdain for the big house. No matter how much respect is shown to Mr. Zhan in front of others, he looks down on his honest and rigid older brother from the bottom of his heart. Although his sister-in-law is shrewd, it is not up to women to take charge of the big house, and it is still the older brother who makes the decisions. As for Zhan Feiyu, his niece, Zhan's second wife, has a bit more disgust in her eyes. Fortunately, she is a girl movie, and in a few years, she will be kicked out of her husband's house and earn a dowry money. As for the eldest wife who has no son, she can only be a horse and a cow for his second wife in this lifetime. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. No Hope of Enrollment. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. No Hope of Enrollment. 7 days passed in a blink of an eye, but Zhan Sanlang still forgot his back and the front. He was forced hard by Xiaoyao, so he decided to give up his responsibilities and run away early every morning, leaving no one behind. Xiaoyao was so angry that he didn't even have breakfast. Under the persimmon tree, Zhan Feiyu obediently sat on a small stool and accompanied old lady Zhan to peel beans. Listening to Antier's curses of resentment, Zhan Feiyu propped up his small chest with a proud expression waiting for praise, and spoke in a crisp voice, "Grandma, I've memorized everything. Xiaoyu is smart. You'll go to the dairy later, and Grandma will give you jujube paste cake." Mrs. Zhan's voice sounded flat, her face calm, but she didn't mention anything about letting Zhan Feiyu enroll. Even though Zhan Feiyu had known this was the result, he still wanted to fight for himself. His soft and incomprehensible voice rang out, "Milk, I want to go to a private school with my big brother." Mrs. Zhan suddenly lifted her head and stared at Zhan Feiyu with a cold and gloomy gaze. Suddenly, she scolded in a harsh voice, "Your mother is just a fool. No girl goes to a private school, how can she get married in the future?" The second daughter-in-law said that Li Shi spent the whole night confined to Xiaoyu's endorsement, preferring to waste a year of 10 taels of silver for maintenance rather than letting Erlang and Sanlang go to private schools. Her mind was malicious and ruthless. Mrs. Zhan relies heavily on her second son and favors her youngest son. She has little affection for the hardworking Mr. Zhan, especially since the eldest wife has no son. Mrs. Zhan doesn't say anything unpleasant and even protects her eldest daughter-in-law, the Li family, but from the bottom of her heart, she doesn't like the Li family. These past few days, Xiaoyao has been complaining incessantly, and Mrs. Zhan is naturally unhappy after listening too much. As soon as Zhan Feiyu asked these words, old lady Zhan became angry, with a wrinkled face and a fierce look of dissatisfaction and disgust towards the Li family. "Uncle said that if you recognize a character, you are a lady from a wealthy family." Zhan Feiyu stubbornly retorted, feeling extremely sad and aggrieved for himself and his own mother. "Don't listen to your uncle's nonsense." Mrs. Zhan sternly dropped her words, picked up the green beans from the dustpan, and got up into the kitchen. She didn't scold her granddaughter, but in her heart, she wrote a note for Li. Sure enough. Sitting on the small stool, Zhan Feiyu laughed with a self-deprecating smile at the corner of his mouth. In recent years, he has been dressed in colorful clothes to entertain his family and show filial piety to his elders, but at a critical moment, his grandparents' hearts are still wandering. Looking at the house of the Zhan family, it was as dark as a devouring beast. Zhan Feiyu felt suppressed and uncomfortable, so he got up and walked out of the yard. When Zhan Feiyu walked slowly into the vegetable field, his low, suffocated, sour, and unwilling emotions had already been restrained. Looking at the tall figure holding a hoe and weeding in the vegetable field, Zhan Feiyu suddenly felt a sour nose. Looking at the swaying figure on the field ridge from a distance, Mr. Zhan wiped the sweat off his face and his rough voice rang out, "Little fish, why are you here? Dad, you drink some water." Zhan Feiyu picked up the bamboo tube placed under the shade of the tree and handed it over. Today is a cloudy day, but after all, it is the hottest July. Dad's clothes are soaked with sweat and his face is red from the sun. It is indeed a kind person to be bullied by others. Uncle Air said the day before yesterday that it was too hot and there was no work to do in the county, but he still got up early and drove the ox cart to the county. He only returned after the sun had set, and even if he couldn't make money, he wouldn't go for a day. He just didn't want to stay at home and work. But the little uncle has a wild temperament and loves to be lazy. He sleeps until noon in the morning and goes out for a stroll after eating. The old man scolds a few words on his pacifier and doesn't care, and the little uncle doesn't go down to the ground. The most difficult and tiring thing in the entire Zhan family is still his father. Standing under the shade of a tree, gurgling and drinking water, Zhan Laoda looked at Zhan Feiyu, who was not in a high mood, and couldn't help but wonder, "Why aren't you reciting at home?" "Dad, I can memorize even the 3-character classic. Zhan Feiyu still had a last hope in his heart, looking up with a chubby face and asking seriously, "Dad, I have memorized more than second brother in Sanlang. Can I go to a private school if I win? I also want to read." Mr. Zhan was stunned for a moment, met his daughter's bright black eyes, and suddenly his words got stuck in his throat. Since childhood, Xiaoyu has been sensible, eating coarse grains and wearing clothes patched with coarse cloth. However, compared to the pampered little girls in the village, she is much more fair, tender, and beautiful. People who know or don't know her will praise her a few words, saying that Zhan is lucky and his daughter is well taken care of. Without a definite answer, Zhan Feiyu's expression dimmed, and the light in his eyes gradually faded away. He lowered his head in disappointment and said, "Dad, can't you do it? Even if you win, can't you do it? Xiaoyu, Dad." Zhan Laoda wiped his face fiercely, wanting to say yes. He couldn't bear to see Xiaoyu so disappointed. Where can a girl from all over the country go to a private school? A year of 10 taels of silver is all saved by tightening one's belt. If one agrees, parents will definitely not agree, and the second and third families will not nod. It will definitely make the house uneasy. Why? Zhan Feiyu looked at the neatly arranged vegetable fields one by one, and a strong sense of unwillingness surged in his heart, causing him to feel resentful towards the blood-connected Zhan family for the first time. It is said that a clean official cannot handle household affairs. The Zhan family, consisting of over a dozen people, live under the same roof, and there are many conflicts and disputes between family members. However, Zhan Feiyu can see through and think about it. Zhan Feiyu knew the advantages of having a second room, but after all, they were all petty gains. She didn't want to worry about them. When she grew older, not only did she earn much money, but she could at least ensure that her parents had no worries about food and clothing, and didn't have to work in the fields with her back to the sky. Going to a private school to study is not ordinary. De Lang spends 10 taels of silver a year on training, and if you include San Lang, it will cost 20 taels, not to mention the cost of pens, ink, paper, and inkstones. In addition, even the county and government trials will cost silver. If Dalong Sanlang were a young scholar, his second uncle and aunt wouldn't have much calculation. Zhan Feiyu would be willing to endure any hardship, but in reality, the big house was struggling to provide for the second house. At this moment, Zhan Feiyu wished he could divide the Zhan family, but he turned his head to look at Mu Ran with an expression on his face, his eyes filled with helplessness, annoyance, and worry. Zhan Feiyu's heart softened again. In these years, his mother had not made a face-wrenching noise, so he didn't want his father to be caught in the middle and make things difficult. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Screaming and Cursing. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Screaming and cursing. The sun has set, leaving only a little bit of residual heat. The Zhan family sat in the yard to cool off after dinner, but the atmosphere seemed low. Can't stay idle for a moment, Zhan Sanlang, are you going to heaven? Xiao Yao looked at her little son jumping up and down like a wild monkey, and her anger surged out. Ma was feeding water to the 3-year-old Zhan Nyonyo and glanced at Zhan Sanlang, who was agile in his movements. He deliberately raised his voice and said, "Second sister. Law, Sanlang's temperament is not suitable for studying." Xiao Yao's face turned extremely pale with a brush. Even though De Lang secretly taught San Lang for half an hour every day, the little bear didn't have the courage to memorize more and forgot more. I ran out early this morning and didn't come back until dinner. Little Yao really wished she could beat her little son up with thin bamboo shreds. Zhan Feiyu sat silently on the small stool, feeling disheartened and too lazy to pay attention to the verbal dispute between his second and third aunts. "Dad, Mom." Li suddenly stood up and looked coldly at the men from the Zhan family who were sitting together talking. Xiaoyu had memorized the 3-character classic the day before yesterday. Shouldn't Xiaoyu go to a private school? In an instant, the courtyard was quiet and could only hear the chirping of crickets in the corner of the wall. The old and young members of the Zhan family did not expect the kind and gentle Li family to suddenly say these words. "Mother." Zhan Feiyu looked at Li Shi in a daze, feeling a warm current in his heart. Mother only spoke for herself. Li gave her daughter a comforting glance, her gaze fixed on Mr. Zhan and Mrs. Zhan. She couldn't rely on her own man, so she had to rely on herself to fight for opportunities for Xiaoyu. Mother and daughter were connected, and she knew Xiaoyu's desire to study better than anyone else. In the deathly silence, a fierce shout suddenly rang out, "Li Shi, please shut up for me." Mrs. Zhan stood up and rubbed her finger at the Li family, spitting fiercely and scolding, "Which girl goes to a private school? You think silver is from a flood of water? Li Fengyu, if you don't want to make ends meet, go back to your mother's house for me." After cursing the eldest daughter. Law, Mrs. Zhan turned her head and slapped her hard on the back. Her thin lips flipped, and sharp curses splashed out with saliva. "How did I give birth to something useless like you? It's not yet up to your daughter. Law to be the master of the Lao Zhan family. What do you want from the big house? Erlang Sanlang doesn't study, let the girl go to the movies. Will Erlang Sanlang still have the face to see people in the future? Our Lao Zhan family doesn't have anyone to bring with them anymore." Mrs. Zhan's voice was sharp, and her old and rough hands, like chicken feet, slapped against her back with great force as if she were fighting a life-or-death enemy. "Mom, don't hit Big Brother. Big Brother just loves little fish." Zhan Air quickly stopped the splashing old lady Zhan and prevented her from continuing to hit Big Brother Zhan. "Don't I feel sorry for my granddaughter? It's not like we don't have any money at home." Mrs. Zhan stared fiercely at Mr. Zhan, with a harsh and wrinkled face. She cursed sternly, "I'm not dead yet. When I'm dead, you can make decisions as you want." "Mother, I..." Mr. Zhan opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. Listening to his mother's sudden death, Mr. Zhan could only remain silent with a tense face. "I'll just hit my head and die as you wish." Mrs. Zhan let out a mournful shout, pushing away Zhan Air who was about to stop her, as if she was really going to hit the wall. Although Zhan Laosan is lazy, he is also filial. He hugged the dying Zhan Laotai and urgently advised, "Mother, what are you talking nonsense about? My son and daughter. Law are trying to force me to death, I won't live anymore." Lying on top of her youngest son, Mrs. Zhan cried loudly, her mournful voice piercing her heart like a soft knife. Third, help your mother sit down. Zhan second instructed and saw Zhan third helping the emotionally agitated old lady Zhan sit down. It was then that he looked at the iron-faced, helpless Zhan eldest. After a long sigh, Zhan heir, who had made up his mind, spoke up and said, "Big brother, why don't we let my third son go to a private school this year? But our second wife will pay for the maintenance every year. This year, let our parents help us advance some money, and I will pay it back when we save money in the future." After careful consideration, Zhan Lauer continued, "Next year, let Erlang go to a private school again. Shuxiu comes from home, and Xiaoyu wants to read and recognize characters. Let De Lang and his team take turns teaching Xiaoyu when they come back from school. My second uncle has left." Upon hearing this, Xiaoyao became unhappy. They were all grandsons of the Zhan family. Why did they have to pay for Sanlang's training on their own? A year of 10 taels of silver for maintenance, isn't it necessary to empty out the private money for the second room? Without waiting for Xiaoyao to shout, Zhan Lauer looked over with a cold warning. Xiaoyao's mouth flattened in dissatisfaction, but she didn't dare to go against Zhan heir's wishes, just her face pulled long. Zhan Feiyu looked at what he said with sarcasm, as if he had suffered all the losses, Uncle heir. This calculation is really clever. Uncle heir asked Sanlang to go to a private school first. After a year of studying, it became a predetermined fact. Even if the family ran out of money next year, it was impossible for Sanlang to retire in exchange for Erlang. The ultimate result is that Erlang and Sanlang all go to private schools, and the Zhan family of more than 10 have to tighten their belts to make a living, while being a big house like a cow and a horse will only be more difficult and tiring. Ma was not willing at first, but she had shallow eyelids and little brain. When she heard that Erfang was solely responsible for the maintenance of Sanlang and did not allow the public to pay, Ma felt that he had taken a big advantage and did not care about Erlang going to a private school a year later. This is a solution, but in the future, your second wife's life will be difficult. This year, you will need 10 taels of repairs, and the pens, ink, paper, and inkstones are all silver. Zhan, the old man, took 2 puffs of dry smoke and showed a perfunctory attitude, showing a peaceful demeanor. As long as everything is peaceful, as long as there is no quarrel or trouble, it will be enough. Dad, it's okay. The 2 children in the second room are studying, so we can't let our older brother and younger brother suffer losses. When I pick up the goods, I can help unload and load them. With a little extra effort, we can earn a little money. Then, let my wife borrow some from her parents' house and let the young man copy books to earn some money. We'll grit our teeth and make it through. Zhan Lauer concealed his calculations and shrewdness in his eyes, and said with a broad smile, "It's not a big deal for me to suffer a little bit and suffer a little. Brothers and harmony are the most important." Second brother. Zhan Lauda looked gratefully at his second brother, feeling a bit ashamed in his heart. Since the sudden incident of the Li family, Mr. Zhan's face has been tense. He feels sorry for his daughter, but also knows about the family's predicament. In a dilemma, Mr. Zhan is extremely irritable and his expression is difficult to see the extreme. However, he did not expect his second brother to take the initiative to bear the maintenance of Sanlang, which was originally supposed to be paid by the public. Second brother, then according to what you said, my Erlang will go again next year. Lang Xiao rang out, and Zhan Laosan nodded in agreement. Zhan Laosan cannot endure hardship, and Ma is not worth it, so Zhan Laosan cannot say if he can bear the cost of his son's training. Second brother, this method is good. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Give a slap. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Give a slap. Her second uncle, according to the previous statement, Xiaoyu won the competition. As soon as Li Shi said this, the Zhan family looked at Li Shi with displeasure. You troublemaker, even the second son has suffered such a big loss. Aren't you satisfied? Are you trying to force me to death? Mrs. Zhan, who was sitting on the chair, jumped up high. Mrs. Zhan looked at her slender figure but fiercely rushed towards Li Shi. She raised her hand and slapped Li Shi's face. I'll beat you to death, you troublemaker. The scene that had just calmed down became chaotic again, with curses and cries of persuasion mixed together with the sound of footsteps and stools falling to the ground. Ma quickly grabbed the splashing old lady Zhan, and Xiao Yao pretended to block her a few times, shouting at the top of her throat, Mom, have something to say. Sister-in-law, please apologize to Mom quickly. What kind of anger have you made to Mom? Hurry up and hold on to your mother, don't fall. Zhan Eyre shouted and rushed over to fight. Looking at Zhan Feiyu mixed in the middle, Zhan Laoer's eyes changed sharply. Taking advantage of the darkness and chaos, he kicked towards Zhan Feiyu. Instinctively alert to danger, Zhan Feiyu's pupils tightened and his body suddenly flashed to the left. Zhan's second kick still hit the right side of Zhan Feiyu's waist, causing his short and chubby body to fall heavily on the ground. Zhan Feiyu let out a painful hiss. Zhan Laoer looked at Zhan Feiyu lying on the ground with a sinister and vicious gaze. Unfortunately, if this girl could lie in bed for 10.5 days, everything would be resolved. Zhan Laoer withdrew his feet and stood beside Zhan Laotai, as if nothing had happened, while in the chaos, the others did not notice Zhan Feiyu's short stature. Pop! Suddenly, there was a crisp round of applause, and everyone in the yard was stunned. Zhan Feiyu looked up and saw that Li's cheek, which had been hit off the side, quickly turned red and swollen. As he looked at Zhan, who was still holding out his arms while hitting, Zhan Feiyu's eyes suddenly turned red. You go back to the house. With both hands gripping Li's shoulders, Zhan Laoda's face turned pale and he roared low, his teeth clenching as if trying to suppress his irritable emotions. Mother! Zhan Feiyu, ignoring the pain of being kicked and thrown, stumbled up from the ground and hugged Li's legs with heartache. He looked up at her red eyes, tears rolling down his face. Mother! Her face was numb and swollen, and she was stunned for a while. After regaining her senses, Li Shi patted Zhan Feiyu's head and looked coldly at the angry Zhan boss with disappointed eyes. Seeing the slap mark on Li's face, Mr. Zhan had already regretted it, but he still kept his face taut and yelled in a rough and hoarse voice under his anger, It's me who's useless, it's me who can't make any money, it's all me, a father's loser. On one side were his own daughter-in-law and daughter, and on the other were his parents and brothers. Mr. Zhan was in pain like a trapped animal, and his fist hit the wall with a loud bang. As if unable to relieve his inner helplessness and irritability, Mr. Zhan punched him hard again, as if this could vent his inner frustration. Big brother. Zhan Laosan looked at Zhan Laoda's bloody hands and rushed over to hug his arm. He cried out in pain, Big brother, if you have something to say, why are you doing this? Boss. Old Zhan snapped and cursed urgently as he looked at his painful and self-abusive eldest son. Speak up. Don't you want your right hand anymore? In the silence, listening to the deep and rapid breathing of Mr. Zhan, the Zhan family felt suffocated and uncomfortable in their hearts. Sister-in-law, I'll take you back to your room. Ma, who was frightened, whispered and quickly supported Li's arm, then looked at Zhan Feiyu and said, Little fish, help your mother back to her room. Looking at the expressionless mother with heartache, Zhan Feiyu turned around and glanced at the wooden father standing by the wall, with a bloody back on his right hand. An indescribable sadness surged in my heart. Suppressing his tumultuous emotions, Zhan Feiyu grabbed Li's hand and pleaded softly, Mom, let's go back to the room. Li didn't say a word. She had a soft and tough personality. Even if the person who took action this time was Mrs. Zhan, Li tried to argue with her face, but it was her own man who took action. Mother. Looking at Li Shi, who was heartbroken, Zhan Feiyu felt panicked and suddenly regretted why he went to a private school. If it weren't for himself, Mother would never have spoken up. Perhaps sensing the panic and fear in Zhan Feiyu's voice, Li regained her senses and grabbed her daughter's hand, turning around and walking back towards the room. The oil lamp was lit up, and the faint light illuminated the bedroom. Looking at the mother sitting in bed, Zhan Feiyu touched her painful right waist and didn't say anything in the end. Xiaoyu, Mom is fine, don't be afraid. Li looked at her helpless daughter with a heart-wrenching expression and comforted her head. Your father is a troublemaker in the house, and his temper only goes against us. I've been used to it for these years. Boss Zhan has no ulterior motives and is stubborn. He looks fierce, but in fact, it's better to speak up. He would rather suffer some losses on his own than have conflicts with outsiders. Having suffered losses many times, after being scolded by the Li family for a few words, Mr. Zhan felt embarrassed and would even shout loudly, but he never took action. Today is his first time. Your second uncle has always been able to speak, and your father is convinced of him. If it weren't for me guarding, our big house would have been squeezed clean by your second uncle. Li Shi looked out the window, her eyes filled with resentment. She only hated her own man for not having a brain, and even if Li Shi was transparent, she couldn't express her pain. Mom, I'll give you a cloth towel to chill your face. Zhan Feiyu didn't want to talk about this topic anymore and turned to walk towards the door. At this moment, she could understand the pain in Mom's heart better than anyone else. If it were just the calculation of the second uncle, neither I nor my mother would be afraid, but this soft knife was the kind of frustration, suffocation, and pain that the father stabbed at them. Xiao Yao and Ma had just poured the cold well water they had brought up into the wooden basin when they saw Zhan Feiyu walking out of the bedroom with short legs. Ma stretched his neck and glanced inside, then wrung the cloth towel dry and handed it over. Little fish, take it and cover your mother's face, he said. Thank you, Auntie. Zhan Feiyu took the cloth towel and returned to the room. He also closed the door, blocking the prying eyes of Xiao Yao and Ma. Without any ointment and relying solely on cold compress with well water, Li's face had already turned red and swollen, with clear visible fingerprints and dried bloodstains remaining at the broken corners of her mouth. Zhan Feiyu's nose and hair are sour, she said. Being a mother is useless. Li Shi hugged Zhan Feiyu tightly, and tears that she had been holding back with her eyes closed finally fell silently. Li buried her face on her daughter's small shoulder, tears rolling down and soaking Zhan Feiyu's clothes. Mother, I can still read and recognize characters even if I don't go to a private school. Zhan Feiyu's thick and short arm forcefully hugged Li, as his previous firm belief in going to a private school collapsed. All the money in the family is in the hands of my grandmother, and my father has not made a deal. My mother cannot argue or leave with my father for the sake of herself. Even if we do, she must stay in the Zhan family and cannot go to a private school. A penny can't defeat a hero. Zhan Feiyu felt immense sadness. End of this chapter.